Yeah. Morning, everyone. I hope everybody's happy this morning. We're going to be reading from the Mysterium Encounter today, which is a very interesting passage in the Red Book. And I'm just going to wish everyone a good morning on the YouTube chat. Okay, so yesterday we had this wonderful talk by Dr. Mary Stein. I hope everyone will take a look at that. And I'm going to put the link to it for the replay. So everybody can take a look at that in replay. And, you know, I hope it gets broadly seen, because it's an incredible talk that we had yesterday. And it's right on point. You know, even if the Banshees of Inisherin doesn't win an Academy Award tonight, it is a intense movie about these issues of the construction, or Men Under Construction, which was Mary Stein's book. And so I hope you'll go see the review that Alexander Beiner wrote, which is in the announcement today. I put it in the announcement so you can find it and read that. It will help you understand where men stand in this part of the 21st century in general. And it's a very important issue to take a look at. Of course, we are dealing with the feminine rising in our confluence next October. And because this had become such a big issue in social media and entertainment, not only in movies, but in games and that sort of thing, it is something that we really had to address. And so we have done, and I hope that our discussion with Mary Stein will be very broadly viewed. So we're reading from the Red Book by C.G. Jung, and this section, Mysterium Encounter, also has an addendum to it. And that addendum is addendum B at the back of the book. I'm proposing that we read that addendum at the end of our reading of this section and our reading and discussion of this section. And so we will do that, but if you have your book and if you've read it, I urge you also to read the addendum B in the back of this book. And so I am going to be reading from page 174 of the Reader's Book of the Red Book by C.G. Jung. Mysterium Encounter. On the night when I considered the essence of God, I became aware of an image. Now, keep in mind, Dr. Jung is now doing an active imagination in which he envisions people or animals or whatever, and they talk to him. And so that the Red Book is the history of those encounters, especially. And so this is Mysterium Encounter. On the night when I considered the essence of the God, I became aware of an image. I lay in a dark depth. An old man stood before me. He looked like one of the old prophets. A black serpent lay at his feet. Some distance away, I saw a house with columns. A beautiful maiden steps out of the door. She walks uncertainly and I see that she is blind. The old man waves to me, and I follow him to the house at the foot of the sheer wall of rock. The serpent creeps behind us. Darkness reigns inside the house. We are in a high hall with glittering walls. A bright stone, the color of water, lies on in the background. As I look into its reflection, the images of Eve, the tree, and the serpent appear to me. After this, I catch sight of Odysseus and his journey on the high seas. Suddenly, a door opens on the right, onto a garden full of bright sunshine. We step outside, and the old man says to me, "Do you know where you are?" I am a stranger here, and everything seems strange to me, anxious as in a dream. Who are you? Elijah: I am Elijah, and this is my daughter Salome. I: the daughter of Herod, the bloodthirsty woman? Elijah: why do you judge so? You see that she is blind. She is my daughter, the daughter of the prophet. I: what miracle has united you? Elijah: it is no miracle. It was so from the beginning. My wisdom and my daughter are one. I am shocked. I am incapable of grasping it. Elijah: consider this. Her blindness and my sight have made us companions through eternity. I: forgive my astonishment. Am I truly in the underworld? Salome: do you love me? I: how can I love you? How do you come to this question? I see only one thing. You are Salome, a tiger. Your hands are stained with the blood of the Holy One. How should I love you? Salome: you will love me. I love you? Who gives you the right to such thoughts? Salome: I love you. I: leave me be. I dread you, you beast. Salome: you do me wrong. Elijah is my father, and he knows the deepest mystery. The walls of his house are made of precious stones. His wells hold healing water, and his eyes see the things of the future. And what wouldn't you give for a single look into the infinite unfolding of what is to come? Are these not worth a sin for you? Okay, now there are some footnotes here, so I do want to read those. So the date of this encounter is December 21st, 1913. We're still 7.5 months before World War I. And in Black Book number 2, Jung noted, quote, with a gray beard and wearing an oriental robe, referring to Elijah. And then footnote 157, Elijah was one of the prophets of the Old Testament. He first appears in 1 Kings 17, bearing a message from God to Ahab, the king of Israel. In 1953, the Carmelite pair Bruno wrote to Jung asking how one established the existence of an archetype. Jung replied by taking Elijah as an example, describing him as a highly mythical personage, which did not prevent him from probably being a historical figure. Drawing together descriptions of him throughout history, Jung described him as a living archetype who represented the collective unconscious and the self. He noted that such a constellated archetype gave rise to new forms of assimilation and represented a compensation on the part of the unconscious. And that's taken from Collected Works 18, paragraphs 1518 to 1531. I just want to remind you that paragraph 18, I'm sorry, volume 18 is the volume of Jung's collected works where Jung's heirs and the people who put the collected works together decided to hide things that they didn't want to have to talk about in their lifetime. So they put them in volume 18, and they say, good, if you get this far, then you can know this, but otherwise, it's really a bridge too far to have to think of getting to volume 18. Good morning, Jordan. I'll be with you in a moment.
Good morning. That's a really good point, though, because this is kind of his expression of his inner civil war. And it actually, that comment there about the family hiding things, go figure, it wasn't just because it was in general.
Right. And by family, Jordan means everybody that considered themselves a Jungian in the 20th century, probably.
Right. Yeah.
Mostly including professional Jungian analysts, but it takes somebody like me or Jordan to crash through the rock wall of Jung's collected writings and get to volume 18, where all the good stuff is. Well, not all the good stuff. There's also good stuff in volumes 10 and 11, especially. But a lot of it can be very confusing. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Especially, too, having to, in a sense, go it alone. I mean, I remember 1993, big pile of all the volumes, just going through them. And it was so not Freudian. I remember finishing them all, and then reading them again as if it was the first time, because I didn't even know then that you could, get a degree in psychology and never hear the name Carl Jung at that point.
Yeah. Or I know when my daughter, who's now 48, was in college, she majored in psychology, and I took her freshman psychology book and looked up Jung, and it had 2 paragraphs about him. That's it. And so that's how much he's been pushed aside in the 20th century. But that's over. That's over now. And so he's coming into his own now in terms of what he means and why he's different from Sigmund Freud. Okay, there's one other footnote here, which I do want to read, which is footnote 158. I'm on page 175 of the Reader's Edition. Salome was the daughter of Herodias and the stepdaughter of King Herod. In Matthew 14 and Mark 6, John the Baptist had told King Herod that it was unlawful for him to be married to his brother's wife, and Herod put him in prison. Salome, who is not named but simply called the daughter of Herodias, danced before Herod on his birthday, and he promised to give her anything she wished for. She requested the head of John the Baptist, who was then beheaded. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the figure of Salome fascinated painters and writers, including Guillaume Apollinaire, Gustave Flaubert, Stéphane Mallarmé, Gustave Moreau, Oscar Wilde, and Franz von Stuck, featuring in many works, and including in the works of my friend Tim Holmes, who has painted a number of images with Salome that are very, very powerful and evocative. There's a reference to Bram Dijkstra's Idols of Perversity, Fantasies of Feminine Evil in Fin de Siècle's Culture. Okay, so in 19th century, um, fin de siècle means end of the 19th century. And so the book is entitled Idols of Perversity, Fantasies of Feminine Evil in Fin de siècle Culture, which obviously was a huge put down to women, from Oxford University Press, 1986, pages 379 to 98. Okay,
But
so
that whole time you had, the little boys in charge, in grown men's bodies who, would view a woman's menstrual cycle as the fevers or hysteria. And,
yeah,
that's a bunch of bunk.
right, right. So anyway, so I'm going to go back to this reading. So Salome has just said, and I'll read a little bit more, and then I'll ask Jordan to read. Salome has just said, and what wouldn't you give for a single look into the infinite unfolding of what is to come? Are these not worth a sin for you? Your temptation is devilish. I long to be back in the upper world. It is dreadful here. How oppressive and heavy is the air. Elijah, what do you want? The choice is yours. But I do not belong to the dead. I live in the light of day. Why should I torment myself here with Salome? Did I not have enough of my own life to deal with? Elijah, you heard what Salome said. I cannot believe that you, the prophet, can recognize her as a daughter and a companion. Is she not engendered from heinous seed? Was she not vain greed and criminal lust? Elijah, but she loved a holy man. And shamefully shed his precious blood. Elijah, she loved the prophet who announced the new God to the world. She loved him. Do you understand that? For she is my daughter. Do you think that because she is your daughter, she loved the prophet in John, the father? Elijah, by her love shall you know her. But how did she love him? Do you call that love? Elijah, what else was it? I am horrified. Who wouldn't be horrified if Salome loved him? Elijah, are you cowardly? Consider this. I and my daughter have been one since eternity. You pose dreadful riddles. How could it be that this unholy woman and you, the prophet of your God, could be one? Elijah, why are you amazed? But you see it. We are together. What my eyes see is exactly what I cannot grasp. You, Elijah, who are a prophet, the mouth of God, and she, a bloodthirsty horror. You are the symbol of the most extreme contradiction. Elijah, we are real and not symbols. I see how the black serpent rises up the tree and hides in the branches. Everything becomes gloomy and doubtful. Elijah rises. I follow him. We go silently back through the hall. Doubt tears me apart. It is all so unreal, and yet a part of me, my longing, remains behind. Will I come again? Salome loves me. Do I love her? I hear wild music, a tambourine, a sultry moonlight night, the blood-staring head of the Holy One. Fear seizes me. I rush out. I am surrounded by the dark night. It is pitch black all around me. Who murdered the hero? Is this why Salome loves me? Do I love her? And did I therefore murder the hero? She is one with the prophet, one with John, but also one with me. Woe, was she the hand of the God? I do not love her. I fear her. Then the spirit of the depths spoke to me and said, therein you acknowledge her divine power. Must I love Salome? Okay, Jordan, go ahead and we'll read some of these footnotes.
Okay.
Do you want to comment on this part?
Let me read. Why don't I read the footnotes first? And
okay, why don't you do that?
Because footnote 159, Black Book 2 continues, the crystal shines dimly. I think again of the image of Odysseus, how he passed the rocky island of the Sirens on his lengthy odyssey. Should I not? And then the bloody head was obviously John the Baptist. And then I'll go proceed reading in this part 2. This play that I witnessed is my play.
Whoa, don't get ahead of us here. You have to read 161 too, footnote 161.
There we go. Okay. In the 1935 seminar, Jung recounted, I used the same technique of the descent, but this time I went much deeper. The first time, I should say I reached a depth of about 1,000 feet, but this time it was a cosmic depth. It was like going to the moon, or like the feeling of a descent into empty space. First, the picture was of a crater on a ring chain of mountains, and my feeling association was that of one dead, as if oneself were a victim. It was the mood of the land of the hereafter. I could see 2 people, an old man with a white beard and a young girl who was very beautiful. I assumed them to be real and listened to what they were saying. The old man said he was Elijah, and I was quite shocked. But she was even more upsetting because she was Salome. I said to myself that that was a queer mixture, Salome and Elijah. But Elijah assured me that he and Salome had been together since eternity. This also upset me. With them was a black serpent who had an affinity for me. I stuck to Elijah as being the most reasonable of the lot, for he seemed to have a mind. I was exceedingly doubtful about Salome. We had a long conversation, but I did not understand it. Of course, I thought of the fact of my father being a clergyman as being the explanation of my having figures like this. How about this old man then? Salome was not to be touched upon. It was only much later that I found her association with Elijah quite natural. Whenever you take journeys like this, you find a young girl with an old man. From Analytical Psychology, pages 63 to 64. Jung then refers to examples of this pattern in the work of Melville, Meyrink, Rider Haggard, and the Gnostic legend of Simon Magus. See note 154 on page 359. Kundry and Klingsor from Wagner's Parsifal, see below page 303. And Francesco Colonna's Hypnerotomachia in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. He noted in myths, the snake is a frequent counterpart of the hero. There are numerous accounts of their affinity. Therefore, the presence of the snake was an indication of a hero myth. Of Salome, he said, Salome is an anima figure. She is blind because she does not see the meaning of things. Elijah is the figure of the wise old prophet and represents the factor of intelligence and knowledge. Salome, the erotic element. One might say that the 2 figures are personifications of Logos and Eros, but such a definition would be excessively intellectual. It is more meaningful to let the figures be what they were for me at that time, namely events and experiences. Page 206 to 207. In 1955 to 56, Jung wrote, For purely psychological reasons, I have elsewhere attempted to equate the masculine consciousness with the concept of logos. On Jung's reading of Elijah and Salome in terms of logos and eros, respectively, see Appendix B in the commentaries.
Okay, the footnote is a little bit different in the reader's edition. I believe you're reading a version that's online, right? And
I have the digital. Yeah.
Okay, let me read the last bit in the reader's edition. So in the reader's edition in 1955-56, Jung wrote, "For purely psychological reasons, I have elsewhere attempted to equate the masculine consciousness with the concept of logos and the feminine with that of eros. But by logos, I meant discrimination, judgment, insight. And by eros, I mean placing into relation. Mysterium Conjunctionis, collected work 14, paragraph 224. On Jung's reading of Elijah and Salome in terms of logos and eros, respectively, see Appendix B of the commentaries." Okay, and that's the appendix I mentioned at the beginning of this, which we'll read after we read this chapter.
I'm glad you read that, because I have that in here, and I should have just zoomed in, because with the small text, I just missed one line.
Oh, okay.
And that's
all right.
That's a really important distinction.
And there's a passage in here that's supremely important for Jungian psychology, and I want to just reread two sentences. Jung is in a speech, and he said on page 176 of the reader's edition, near the bottom, and he says, "You are a symbol of the most extreme contradiction." And Elijah responds to him, and this is very important: "We are real, not symbols. We are real, not symbols." Okay, do you want to talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, because I definitely, with the logos, he meant discrimination, judgment, insight, and eros, he meant placing into relation. What happens then is being real and not symbols. It's both and. So this is, the real life, which has intellect, but it also has heart. And I would say, rather than the heart of the matter here being not symbols, it's the creative principle, which would be individuation of the marrow of the matter. So the structure has no stricture. So, for example, the blood creates the bone and the bone marrow in, say, a femur. And I think what happens is we are real and not symbols puts that character in context beyond intellect and relation and into life being living, rather than symbols being generative and indicating something else.
Right. Okay, so I wanted to emphasize this a little bit differently, because Jung is constantly, throughout his collected works, talking about the word symbols. And indeed, the book that he wrote for, or that he had written and he wrote partially near his death, is called Man and His Symbols. And so there's a very, very important distinction here. Symbols are not themselves that significant thing. What is significant is what's behind them. And so in John 1:1, for example, where it says, "In the beginning was the Word," the word in that verse, the very word "in the beginning was the Word" is a symbol. That word is symbolic of everything that went on before in Judaism. Everything is represented in that symbol, the Word. And so it is a symbol, but is not alive. Okay. And what is alive is everything that's behind it and everything that is within the psyche of the first century Jew at that time. Okay. Which is uh, everything that had happened since the time of Abraham. And um, and so what Elijah is talking about when he says we are real, we are not symbols. What he is saying is that the ability to have the conversation with these unconscious figures and the unconscious figures themselves are living entities within Jung's psyche. Okay, they're living entities within Jung's psyche. They're not symbols of Jung's psyche, they are real. And this is such a fundamental point in Jungian psychology that must be understood and acknowledged, that, you know, what Jung said in paragraph 751 of Answer to Job, where he said, what people can't grasp, what they can't understand is, I believe the psyche is real. They think that they have to be able to touch something in order for it to be real, but that is not the case. Okay, the psyche itself is real. And he uses this wild comparison. He said, if it were not so, then it must be the laboratory equipment or the uranium itself that created the atom bomb. And obviously, it wasn't the laboratory equipment and it wasn't the uranium that created the atom bomb. The atom bomb was created in the minds of human beings and in the living realness of the psyche of the thousands of human beings that worked on, you know, on fission and physics in the 20th century, going back to Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg. And I'm just reading a play called Copenhagen, which Murray Stein had mentioned last summer when he spoke to us in August. And he said this was the model for the play that we did last summer called The Analyst and the Rabbi. And he said Copenhagen was the model for what they did to create the scene in the Savoy Hotel in Zurich. But Niels Bohr and Heisenberg, Bohr became sort of the bedrock of the Manhattan Project, and Heisenberg was the head of nuclear physicists in Germany. And so the two of them met one time in the middle of September of 1931 in Copenhagen. They met at Niels Bohr's home, or I'm sorry, it was in 1941 that they met. So the war was on. Germany had invaded and occupied Denmark, and Bohr was 50% Jewish by heritage, and Heisenberg had been called the White Jew. And because of the Nazi pigheadedness about race and the Jewish question in Nazi Germany, the Nazis had not allowed the research for fission to go forward, and so it's a very interesting play where the two men are meeting. I haven't read the whole thing as yet, but it's an incredible juxtaposition of the two men. And the play did appear on Broadway and won a Tony Award back in the early 2000s. and it was on the stage in London for many years. And so I'm interested in this play and whether it could be produced by our poor acting troupe. But in any case, this is an incredibly important distinction. A symbol represents something that's behind it. It's not necessarily alive, but it represents everything that's there. So when you see the cross on a Christian church, it represents everything that's happened in Christianity for the last 2023 years. And it isn't those things, it's a symbol of those things. But here, Elijah, in Jung's active imagination, says, we are real, we are not symbols. Okay, and the point is that they are real as part of Jung's psyche, of his living psyche. Okay, so I'm sorry for that homily and digression, but
no, that's not a digression at all. In fact, you've given me an idea I had not had before, that the real, not symbols, real, not symbols, that the symbol is the persona of a living archetype. The symbol is a persona of a living thing, but it is not the thing, it's how the thing is presented or presents. So I think the question with all that, what's behind, is when a symbol is present, is the substance generating the surface? Therefore, the symbol is intact and generative truthfully, versus is it a deception where the symbol is really a mask that covers the truth? And so I think that you've just given me kind of an inroad to forensically interpreting, when I see a symbol, okay, what does it mean? For example, if I see the swastika, well, if I'm only schooled in 20th century history, well, that's going to be relatively evil.
20th century Western history. But
then if I go back 4,000 years to China, it's the wheel of life, and the Native Americans had the wheel of life. And so that symbol was co-opted and the meaning was changed by basically guilt by association. But for that symbol will forever be marred from what it meant to be, what it was meant to be.
Precisely. And let us remember, we'll talk about symbols. There are millions of symbols in this book. Every word is a symbol. Every word isn't anything except ink on a page, okay? And what it is a guide. It guides our mind, it guides our psyche to think about things in certain ways. So if you're lucky like I am and can envision a novel, I'm not sure everybody can do this, but because I'm quite intuitive, when I'm reading a novel, I don't see the words on the page. I see a movie in my mind. And I don't know if everybody is like that. Do you have an opinion about that, Jordan?
I sure do. People always tell me, well, the book was so much better than the movie. It's like, the book is never better than the movie. And it's because they're like, well, you don't read novels. And so I really loathe novels. And the thing is, it's because to me, I'm so visual that it's work. And I'm not resting when I'm reading a novel. I'm resting when I read a, peer-reviewed paper or something, and then I'm learning something. But when I'm reading a novel, it's not so much anymore, but 15, 20 years ago, it was not a break. It was workaholism.
Right. Okay. So
it's just all the same movie.
There's a distinction in psychology between people who are visual, people who are auditory, or people who are kinesthetic. Now, it so happens that I'm extremely kinesthetic, but I'm also secondarily auditory, and I'm not visual, so I don't have that issue that you have. But I I accept and recognize the problem that you're talking about. So if you're extremely auditory and you're used to envisioning things by listening, then probably you're more like me. You just see the movie going by in your mind. But if you're visual, then you need to see an actual picture to appreciate it. And so for a visual person like you, the novel wouldn't be better. Okay, the movie's always better because you don't have to work at it. But for an auditory like me, I always think the book was better because the movie always has to edit and leave things out, which they can't possibly put everything in every movie, or every movie'd be 100 hours long.
Well, yeah, the picture tells 1,000 words. And so that's, tome after tome. What's interesting though, with this question, I haven't revisited this in a long time, but thinking about it from a current view, I think what happened back then too is I much more appreciated poetry than I did novels. But with Dr. John Jackson's Rilke and Lou Andres Salome reading group, it's put me back to revisit poetry in a more direct way rather than enjoying it on the side. And I realized too that there came a time when I wasn't so moved by poetry either. But what it was I simply wasn't focused and interested in it at that time because I had other architecture, tarot, astrology. I had other visual poems that I was, in a sense, catching up.
Yeah.
Because we're not trained to think that way. So you have to self-model. And so I look back now and I can read a novel and it's relaxing. But that's relatively, in the last 5 years recent. And where it's not work because I'm not a director. This isn't the director's cut. And I probably won't make a great movie out of it, but what I will see the mind movie picture. So it's interesting how I think that's the whole, who murdered the hero. And I look back at that and I kind of murdered novels back then, but now they're in a different place.
Right. And it would be very valuable for our audience to go back and listen now to the talk yesterday by Murray Stein, because Murray Stein points out that the hero is only the middle stage of 5 stages in a person's life, especially a man's life, the hero stage. And it's the stage where you're building up your family, you're making your bones as a person. Either you're becoming a foreman on the job, or you're becoming an academic, or what have you. But once you get there, and once you've achieved that, you have the same experience that Dr. Jung had, which was he'd achieved everything he wanted to achieve. And plus he was rich. He was married to the third wealthiest woman in Switzerland. So, what could be wrong with that? And then he came to this cliff and said, now what? And that's the midlife crisis, because once you've heroically achieved that stage where you have your family, you have your home, you have everything that you think you need, maybe you bought yourself a Corvette, whatever it is, then you find out, well, the Corvette's just a clunker out in the garage, and you can have a wonderful boat, but a boat is a hole in the water into which you pour money, and so on. And so, then you say, why am I supporting that hole in the water in which I pour money? It's just a big question. You get to that stage. And so in Mary's talk yesterday, he was talking about 2 more stages that you have to get to after the hero stage. And Joseph Campbell, with the hero's journey, he made us think that that's the end of the road, but that's not true at all. We have to, the hero's journey is only the first half of life, and so we then need to, or heroine's journey, every mother, leaving aside whether women are in business or not, or are working as flagmen out on a construction project, which some now do, leaving that aside, every mother is a heroine, no doubt about it. And with some notable exceptions, but so anyway, what we have to do is get beyond that, the hero's journey stage, and see, okay, what's next? What are we going to be talking about in 50 years? Are we still going to be talking about the hero's journey? Well, I don't think so. I think that, that was a stage, and Joseph Campbell, for years, I thought Joseph Campbell was my guru. Throughout the 1990s, I was reading Campbell, not Jung, and, he made perfect sense to me. But then, stuff happens in your life, and you say, what's going on here? And you start to realize different things. So anyway, I digress, but go ahead.
Directly to that from Jung, I mean, in Man and His Symbols, I don't know what page, but Jung indicates that the murder of the hero is the accomplishment or achievement of maturity, the transcending and leaving or transgressing to have the rite of passage from the initiation of the maturity. That once the hero achieves the story, it finishes that chapter, as it were, you move out into life, not into stories. Your life becomes a story. And in terms of my perspective, I find that I had my hand raised yesterday to ask a question, but then I lowered it because other people had questions, and we were, moving on time. I wanted to make sure everyone else got, their spot. But my question would be, right along with the hero's journey and maturity and the quote unquote midlife crisis, I think the midlife crisis is not a crisis. I think what happens is people who have not been participating through rites of initiation to passage into each phase of their life at 42, pretty much, which is, I call it the Ebenezer transit. Like, think Christmas Carol, Ebenezer Scrooge.
Mm-hmm.
But it's when your natal Neptune is transited by a Neptune squaring it. Well, Neptune is that ocean you're talking about, without the hole to pour money in, like a boat. Mm-hmm. But the thing is, it's formless, as it were. It's the whole ocean contained. But when the Neptune transits and squares is a 90-degree angle. It's an architectural bracing relationship. So then there's structure without stricture.
Jordan, we had a brief hiccup here. So I didn't hear everything after, without the whole pouring money in like a boat. So everything after that I missed. Okay. So could you repeat it again, please?
Yeah, I think the rite of passage, the quote unquote midlife crisis, is, it's so referred to. I think what happens is that is the passage where it's your job to self-induce your own rite of passage to birth the rest of your life into the next phase. And astrologically, it's also the time your natal Neptune is squared by transiting Neptune. Neptune is boundaryless, it's oceanic, it's almost without structure. But if I look at the ocean and have to attribute structure to it, I would say structure without stricture. And then that brings the planet Uranus into play, which is the growth principle. It lives under Saturn, the status quo's throne. Mm-hmm. And because of that, like a crab, when it's time to grow, crack, that shell opens up and it expands. And what I find then is the structure, and this is key here, I think, the structure reconstitutes to incorporate all of the new growth without any compromise. So I think at 42 and they're around 40 to 44, I think that's that point that's I won't go into it further astrologically, but that's a point of 6 groups of 7. 6 times 7 is 42, or 7 sixes. And so you're playing with different rhythms that are synchronized at that point in your life. And so at that point, I find your responsibility to self-create your own rite of passage. And some people who have not had the initiation to have the passage, they're confused. They have to buy a shiny sports car. I laugh. I got the sports car when I was in my early 30s, and someone said, "Oh, early midlife crisis," and I said, "Oh, no, it's a third life crisis."
Well, okay, everybody thinks the red sports car is the thing, and I once knew a guy that had about 30 different red sports cars. He actually had a garage full of them, and he said that there was this one stretch of highway near his home where he would run every one of them at 100 miles an hour just to experience them, and then he would put them in the garage and he wouldn't drive them again. And and you'd say, "Oh my goodness," and so anyway, coming back to Jung, let's come back to Jung though. Jung, what is really the first guy that is kind of realizing that there's something more. Okay, keeping in mind that most people that are authoritarian, for example, but most people who are Freudian think that you reach this pinnacle at midlife and then you're supposed to just gut it out the rest of your life. This is you've built yourself up. This is your structure. Live with it. Tough it out, right? Too bad. And Jung is realizing that there is something more. Okay, but at the same time, he's coming up to a cliff himself. He mentions during this period that he had a pistol in his nightstand and he nearly blew his brains out because he had to understand the death of the hero. Okay, when he got to the scene where he killed Siegfried, he realized that he had to understand that dream or shoot himself. Okay, and that's basically the emotion that happens at the time you get your midlife crisis. You make all these accomplishments, and I had many in my early life, including, well, never mind, because everybody knows, but I had many in my early life, and then you get to that stage, and it goes back to that song, "Is that all there is? Is that all there is?" Okay, and the answer to that is no, that's not all there is. But you have to get past that passage, and there is a cliff, there is a pistol in the nightstand, and if you don't get yourself past it, you're in trouble, and that's why we have lots and lots of suicides, and the biggest victims of having too many guns in the country is older guys who blow their brains out. Okay, we lose about 20 U.S. veterans a day to suicide because they kill themselves, they shoot themselves, and because they haven't understood that there's a next phase of life, and they can get to that. But I think it's very typical that people need someone to guide them through it. And maybe people understand this and maybe not. But, the point is that Freud's approach was very rigid. So, once he got to the top of his game, he wanted Jung to be exactly a cookie cutter example of him. That's why he wanted Jung to be the crown prince in Freud's thought. And Jung says, "Wait a minute, no, I'm not going to be a cookie cutter Sigmund Freud. I'm going to be something else because this is too rigid. Okay, this is too authoritarian, and I'm not going to find satisfaction here."
But he graduated. that was one of his murder of the hero, is leaving Freud, which happens.
Absolutely.
That's the child becoming the parent of the adult.
Right.
And then that 42-year-old piece is the adult becoming the parent, birthing the rest of your life. The first one goes from parenting to you begin the maturation. But then
Right.
42, you are the maturation and you are the maturity. And then it's your job, your personal responsibility to self-direct yourself instead of being told anymore what to do. And my joke is, after 18, validation should only be for parking. So, I
Yeah.
mean, it's like, that kind of thing. You
Well,
go
there's
your own way.
right. There's very important. There's a very important statement that has come up on the chat that we need to address right away. And that's by Richard, who says, I learned yesterday from an old video of Skip's that Jung was involved in a menage a trois relationship for decades, and it blew all respect I had for him away. Well, and my response to that is that Richard's concept of what a great man should be is based on a very rigid structure that says that once you pick your wife, that's it, and you don't succeed unless you keep that same wife, etc. And and I'm not going to go into my own life, but I certainly, I had a wife with 3 beautiful daughters, absolutely beautiful. They're still beautiful. They were beautiful when they were little girls at ages 5 through 12 when I left their mother. But she had created this rigid shell of a marriage. And she just was attacking me left, right, and center every time I tried to do something that was what I was driving toward in my life. And she was trying to hammer me into this structure that she envisioned as the way people are together. And the only way I could have happiness in my life was to leave that. And I realized when my then 8-year-old daughter sent this message down in this spiral staircase we had that said, please stop fighting. And in that moment, I realized that we couldn't, that we could not stop fighting. And I realized that would be, if we continued on that way, it would be destructive to my daughters. And
I think I sit on the same side of the fence there, and I also knock the fence down, as it were, because I find that throughout history, what people think of me is none of my business, and what I think about some person is none of my business at all. I mean, it's beyond not caring. And it's the kind of thing where historical figures, their personal life, that's none of my business. And I think that with modern society, with the sensationalist, everybody's in everybody's bedroom. Everyone's trying to tell everybody what they do and what's right and what's wrong. Well, only you know what you like. Only you and your partner know what you love. And that's that. And so I appreciate, Richard's comment, but I do also find that kind of jumps out of a prudish notion of duty in society that can actually, I think, get people in trouble, because it's all then about appearances rather than the substance that you're working with. And so, for the example, the menage a trois with Jung and Emma and Tony, it's none of my business, and that's just what their personal life was. And so,
right.
To me, it does not discount in any way what they do. So I'm not going to only read the books that are by the teacher's pet up in the front of the class. I want the troublemakers in the back of the class and a couple people in the middle who actually do something too. So I appreciate Richard's comment, but I also don't find that that's a real good forensic to determine merit.
Well, what I would say is there were three parties to the menage a trois, and whether or not there was sexuality involved in it, and it's not clear that there was. They certainly, Jung certainly had Toni Wolff as sort of the equivalent of an office wife, if you will. Okay, and there are lots of talk around the last few years about men having a family and a wife, and also an office wife, and so Jung and Emma and Toni all made it work, whatever it was. Okay, now what people knew was that after the war, Jung, or maybe it was even before the war, because Jung had a red Mercedes apparently, and he would park it in Toni Wolff's driveway every Wednesday all afternoon, and people, cluck 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 about that, and nobody knows what went on in that house, in those rooms, in those hours. And so whether or not he had a physical affair with Toni Wolff, we simply do not know, a sexual affair. But it is true that Toni Wolff was an important part of his life, and so was Emma. And Emma, at one point, she was raised in this very rigid structure of Victorian Switzerland also. And what she said about Toni was that she was very grateful to Toni for getting Jung through the Red Book period, his visioning period, which she could not have done. I mean, at that time, she was deeply immersed in raising their 5 children. And she later became an analyst herself, and wrote an amazing book called The Grail Legend, which Marie-Louise von France completed for Jung after Emma's death. And so they both have a credit on that. But, the point is that, regardless of what happened sexually with these people, and who cares, and boy, since the 90s with Bill Clinton, we realized that most people don't give two hoots about it. But 100 years earlier, this was very big stuff. And so, to their great credit, Jung, Toni Wolff, and Emma Jung made it work, whatever it was. And
I'd add to that the potential, I don't mean to be too cold earlier to Richard in his comment, but is to be a little bit more, I think, dignity and difference to the comment. I would maybe, Richard, suggest the forensic of not judging the history of a previous time with our own history here, or any personal ideals or ideology, because if you look back then, what would be scandal now, it was very common to have romantic friendships. Right. And that is a whole different ball of wax than what, the monogamy and the selection process is, espoused to be legally, even typically. But at the same time, not going into that, just the history forensic of romantic friendships were a very common thing. And so judging then by now is kind of, objection, Your Honor, out of, relevance. It comes out of context, which can be tricky. So I think, it's like working with Native American studies. You want to see indigenous people through indigenous eyes, not through the white person's eyes. And if you can't shed that mask, then there's no business being in the business of saying what those things are.
Right. So Richard then follows up by saying, but it alters your persona, does it not? Well, Richard, I can't say whether it alters your persona. It certainly has to alter your projection of what you thought Jung's persona was. And, that comes entirely from you. The persona that you're reading into C.G. Jung is your projection. It isn't the way Jung handled it, or was it himself. I'll be the first to acknowledge that if I knew Jung personally, maybe as a friend, I'm not sure I would be his friend, but he was in, some accounts suggest that he was sort of a uncouth surf type person in the way he ate, among other things. And I might find that hard to sit with if I had invited him over to my house for dinner. And so, I don't judge Carl Jung based on my projection of what that means. I judge him based on what he has meant to me. And to me, he has been my shrink for 35 years. And, it's really not my business what his personal life was about. And, but I do acknowledge that it does alter one's own persona, and it alters your projection of Jung's persona. And that is something that you have to evaluate. I can't address that. And then Richard goes on to say morals are not prudish. And Jung's comment on this was, a shoe that fits you might pinch the foot of another.
If you say morals aren't prudish, I have to say, whose morals? Because it's just like, to me, Voltaire, when someone, corked off, life is hard, he just chortled out laughing. And he said, compared to what? It's that kind of thing where, the morals aren't, that's just really societal opinion. Yeah. Morals are really something that's probably been, you should do this, little Mary, little Johnny. It's a societal parenting. And I think what's happened is that a lot of people try to put on masks and play the pretty picture, but the shiny pretty picture is dangerous because the substance is not generating the surface. You're playing Halloween all year, and my career, and my resume, and my reputation. Well, your reputation really, I think, takes a big hit if you have betrayal one way or the other.
Right.
But other than that, it's a matter of taste. And I think morals are often crunchy old laurels people rest on. And I don't really know what morals are anymore. I never was in prison. I'm not trying to, come back out and reacclimate to life. So I'm not a criminal. I'm not a bad person. I'm not mean to people. And so I think that's really, the Dalai Lama, be kind. And don't be nice. Be kind. Nice is wimpy and weak, but kind is very much important. So we could go and go and go on morals, but it's morals to me it's kind of a community persona. This is acceptable to us, but then that leads to tribalism.
Right. Okay. So I'm going to take up one further thing from the YouTube chat with an apology to Susan Mason, whose statement speaks for itself. So I'm not going to really comment on that. I want to comment on something that Sam says here. He said, I've heard it said that Jung used psilocybin mushrooms during his writing of the Red Book. how does the evidence for this stand? I just want to be very careful. We do not just discuss drug addiction or any sort of drugs on this channel per se. I will respond to this, which is you're saying Zosam is the first I've heard of it, and I've been studying Jung psychology for 35 years. There are many people in the world that are, pretty hypocritical about all kinds of different things that intoxicate you. For example, and so I can't say about Jung, and none of us were there, and so I'm not going to really address it. But I have been in Saudi Arabia 23 times, and these people are extremely straight-laced in their society. They have very, very rigid rules in the tradition of Sigmund Freud, if you will, but they came along before Sigmund Freud did, but about alcohol. And yet, if they're outside of Saudi Arabia, they'll break those rules regularly. And for example, the very strict rules about hijab wearing and abaya wearing, even on Saudi Arabian airlines, as soon as they're outside of Saudi airspace, they'll take the abaya off, the hijab off, and they might order a drink. I've been entertained many times in cafes along the coast of the Red Sea in Jeddah, which is the real home of the king. It's not the capital of Saudi Arabia, but there are many cafes there that are called shisha cafes, and you can find these in Egypt and many places in the Middle East. And what they are cafes where people are smoking hashish, and they call it shisha, but I haven't partaken because I don't smoke, and I wouldn't smoke what they were smoking either. But you go to one of those restaurants, and man, it is like fog in there, and you find yourself flying over the coast of the Red Sea, I can tell you, even if you're not smoking it. And so, there's a lot of hypocrisy in the world about intoxicating beverages and intoxicating smoke and intoxicating pills and what have you. And what I know is that we kill 100,000 people a year with fentanyl. And so we have to be extremely careful with these things. And so
I'd like to
12-step program. Wait a minute, 12-step programs and all those things are not the topic of this YouTube channel. Okay, Jordan, your turn to talk.
Yeah, that's the first I've ever heard. Maybe Jung did psilocybin. I wouldn't judge him if he did. Plenty of shamans have, but again, to the tune of here on this show, that to me sounds like societal conjecture. That someone probably made a joke, opened the Red Book. Oh, wow, what was he on? Oh, I want some of that. I mean, these big images. I think what's interesting is if you've ever done martial arts for an extended period, any kind of discipline of the ritual, holotropic breathing, meditation, you can go into very deep states, and pictures like this aren't really that surprising. These are very expressive, and they're deep, and they're full and robust. But I don't think that any substances would technically be required to have those kind of experiences. I think these days there's a lot of quick fixes have shallow roots, and people have not done the work. So I kind of wonder if did Jung do psilocybin? It's a legitimate question, but I've never heard any indications of it. And I don't see that the dream images painted out are any more surprising than any other intense artwork. his just happens to be Grimm's fairy tale level descriptive of the human psyche.
Yeah,
and I think that self-awareness is more, I would be the question rather than the chemical.
well, and I did have a visioning experience of 8 months, which was every bit as vivid as Jung's. And it became a novel, which I wrote under a pen name. And I did not take any drugs or alcohol to get that novel. It just happened to me, and I had no choice but to complete it. I did not understand it when it happened in 1993, and it was only 16 years later when the Red Book came out that I said, "Oh, wow, I'm not crazy. This happened to the smartest psychiatrist, psychologist of the 20th century. So if it happened to him, and then it's okay if it happened to me." But it was only thanks to the Red Book that I could see that my experience was actually something that can happen to a normal human being who is not drug addicted, who's not an alcoholic. My grandfather was an alcoholic, but I certainly am not. I almost never take a drink these days. Maybe I take one every quarter or something like that, but nothing serious. So anyway, these legends can get just out of control. And what I feel about the Red Book is, this is no more surprising than what my experiences were. I'm not saying I had the same experiences. I did not, but what I can say is that the experiences were not drug or alcohol induced in any way.
And I think that's important, because I think even you just expressed another example of talking about the historical forensic of romantic friendships to discern an opinion now that, 1993, I'm painting in oils. And I remember saying to someone, if I told you what I was thinking and feeling right now, which I can't put words to, you'd lock me up. And what it was I was scared of that, goody two shoes. These thoughts the paintings were intense. Okay, cool. People can think whatever they want. But it's interesting because then Jung comes along and I'm like, oh, like you said, the greatest psychiatrist of the 20th century. Oh, if he can, then I can. But what happens is then that means I had a big time expectation that I had not inspected, something that I assumed was, the right and good, real, right, and true way to do something. Until then, I really didn't need to worry about that. I should have continued. And so I think that, judging ourselves by comparison energy can be pretty detrimental to our own growth. So I think back to and I think Richard's comment is pretty important about how people dispense with other people, how people drop them down a notch or take, lost all respect, as he said. I think if we inspect what we expect, then we can forensically grow more easily because it's our way instead of the way we've been told to.
Right. Now, I have a few new things that have come up on YouTube, so I'll have to respond to them. Richard says, I'm seeing the whole picture now. No wonder the man was so tortured. I would say, you're seeing the whole picture? Wow. That's that's impressive. I don't think I certainly would never make such a claim. And
I don't think a Wednesday red Mercedes ritual weekly is torture. That's scheduling.
Well, that's scheduling, and God knows what happened in that apartment for that afternoon every week. And so I'm not going to make a judgment about a man based on where his red Mercedes is. And
he may have, run in, had a short conversation, run out the back door, and run naked through the daisies in the woods or something.
Right, who knows? Yeah, and And Richard says that he's been having an active imagination for 4 years, and he says it's not his own. And Richard, I would say, I think it would be very wise for you to write it down. Write it down as much as you can. This is exactly what Dr. Jung recommended, which is that everyone needs to create their own red book, and
And write it down and paint it out also.
Write it down, paint it out, do whatever you can to bring it into concrete consciousness, because only then can you address it. And Jung had this 5-year visioning period that he wrote down in his black books, and he kept writing for another 11 years after that. So the whole period was 16 years. And so you're not going to fix this tomorrow, but you might want to start writing these visions down and making them concrete, and then they won't control you. And then you can start to put them in context in your own life. That's the only thing I could suggest. And
also the image pieces, painting them out also, because what happens with the images, you don't have to make them make sense. Reasons can be wholly unreasonable, just like an intuition. It's difference between fantasy, wishful thinking, and intuition. Intuition's always a little funky or groovy, as it were, but wishful thinking and fantasy is easy. So if you're having an active imagination, I would write it out and paint it out or draw it out, doodle it out, because what happens is you're allowing your psyche to function the way it is supposed to function. And you can learn things from things that are completely unreasonable, because you'll, like Skip said, it can put things in your life in context, and it's your life your way. It doesn't have to make sense to anyone else, or even to you sometimes.
Right. And Snake here says the 12th step came from Dr. Bob's counseling from Jung. Jung is in the big book. I just would point out a book called Jung and Alcoholics Anonymous, which is quite a good book if you're interested in 12-step programs. And Jung himself didn't know this until very near his death for 30 years. But he had counseled some alcoholics in the late 20s, and Bill W. was one who got that counseling secondhand, and it was only 30 years later that Bill W., who was sort of credited with being the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, wrote to Jung and told him how much what he had done 30 years earlier had led to the 12-step programs of Alcoholics Anonymous and now many other 12-step programs. And so I urge everyone to take a look at that book, Carl Jung and Alcoholics Anonymous. And it's a very valuable book, and one can understand that it was actually Bill W. and his friends who developed the 12-step program. It was not Carl Jung, but Carl Jung provided the first impetus to it, which today is keeping people around the world sober. Okay.
And as well, Myers-Briggs,
Right.
mother-daughter team took his work and created the Myers-Briggs. And
Right.
so if we look at all these things, and when Jung received that letter, he was ever thankful.
Right, exactly.
He said, I always wondered what happened to that man. And
right. And he responded to Bill W. and said, thank you for your very decent letter, because
right.
Bill W. had written to him in a very respectful manner, telling him how important that one piece of information that they had from Jung was lived out into the 12-step programs we have today. And so
It's like they naturalized the whole garden with just the one
right.
piece.
Okay, so let's see. Kathy says we are pretty trippy, self-contained psychedelic organisms, and she had also said spirit and hormones are intoxicating, quite so. I'm going to stop reading the YouTube channel so we can get back to the text.
Yes.
So I'm on page 178, and you wanted to read this segment, Jordan, so it's your turn to read.
Part, yeah, 2.
Okay, so we're on page 178, part 2 of Mysterium Encounter.
Okay. This play that I witnessed is my play, not your play. It is my secret, not yours. You cannot imitate me. My secret remains virginal, and my mysteries are inviolable. They belong to me and cannot belong to you. You have your own. He who enters into his own must grope through what lies at hand. He must sense his way from stone to stone. He must embrace the worthless and the worthy with the same love. A mountain is nothing, and a grain of sand holds kingdoms, or also nothing. Judgment must fall from you, even taste, but above all, pride, even when it is based on merit. Utterly poor, miserable, unknowingly humiliated. Go on through the gate. Turn your anger against yourself, since only you stop yourself from looking and from living. The mystery play is soft like air and thin smoke, and you are raw matter that is disturbingly heavy. But let your hope, which is your highest good and highest ability, lead the way and serve you as a guide in the world of darkness, since it is of like substance with the forms of that world.
Righto. Now, before we go on, let's read the footnotes. But I just want to say that this segment that we just read really, in a way, summarizes everything we've been talking about for the last 45 minutes.
Yeah, it really does.
And so, Jordan, if you'll read the italicized part again, and we will then read the footnotes. So I'll read the footnotes. Could you read the italicized part again? Because
Certainly.
It's so important.
It is, and this does completely synopsize everything we have been talking about for 45 minutes. I like that in 2 paragraphs. So this play that I witnessed is my play, not your play. It is my secret, not yours. You cannot imitate me. My secret remains virginal, and my mysteries are inviolable. They belong to me and cannot belong to you. You have your own. You have your own. He who enters into his own must grope through what lies at hand. He must sense his way from stone to stone. He must embrace the worthless and the worthy with the same love. A mountain is nothing, and a grain of sand holds kingdoms, or also nothing. Judgment must fall from you, even taste, but above all, pride, even when it is based on merit. Utterly poor, miserable, unknowingly humiliated. Go on through the gate. Turn your anger against yourself, since only you stop yourself from looking and from living. The mystery play is soft like air and thin smoke, and you are raw matter that is disturbingly heavy. But let your hope, which is your highest good and highest ability, lead the way and serve you as a guide in the world of darkness, since it is of like substance with the forms of that world.
Great. All right. So reading the footnotes, 162, he corrects the draft from his black books. He says This, my friend, is a mystery play in which the spirit of the depths cast me. I had recognized the birth of the new God, the conceptual, and therefore the spirit of the depths allowed me to participate in the underworld ceremonies, which we supposed to instruct me about the God's intentions and works. Through these rituals, I was supposed to be initiated into the mysteries of redemption. Okay, that's footnote 162. 163. In the renewal world, you can have no outer possessions unless you create them out of yourselves. You can enter only into your own mysteries. The spirit of the depths has other things to teach you than me. I only have to bring you tidings of the new God and the ceremonies and mysteries of his service. But this is the way. It is the gate to darkness. And finally, the draft continues. The mystery play took place at the deepest bottom of my interior, which is that other world. You have to bear this in mind. It is also a world, and its reality is dark and is large and frightening. You cry and laugh and tremble, and sometimes you break out in a cold sweat for fear of death. The mystery play represents myself, and through me, the world to which I belong is represented. Thus, my friends, you learn much about the world, and through it about yourself, by what I say to you here. But you have not learned anything about your mysteries in this way. Indeed, your way is darker than before, since my example will stand obstructively in your path. You may follow me not on my way, but on yours. And
I think I'd like to share something from Clarissa Pinkola Estes that I think is right in line with this in regards to your way and your stone to stone, step by step, as it were.
mm-hmm.
She says, Clarissa Pinkola Estes, and I'm not sure if this was from an article or an interview or one of her books that I haven't read, but the miracle of the psyche's ways is that even if you are half-hearted, irreverent, didn't mean to, didn't really hope to, don't want to, feel unworthy to, aren't ready for it, you will accidentally stumble upon treasure anyway. Then it is your soul's work to not overlook what has been brought up, to recognize treasure as treasure, no matter how unusual its form.
Precisely. And so, you know, the story is the treasure is buried in the field. The field is in your psyche. You have to find your own treasure. And, you know, there's nothing we can say, or nothing that Dr. Jung can say, or did say, that finds that for you. It's only you that find that. Mm-hmm. And it's only you that find it within yourself. And, you know, I personally pray that when you do this, that you do it soberly, and I pray that you recognize what it is when you find it. That's redemption, okay, to put it in Richard's terms. The issue, everybody thinks redemption is about cheating death. Well, you know, I could care less about death, honestly. I mean, when you're dead, you don't know you're dead. It's only difficult for your family. And so, you know.
I won't finish that joke.
Pardon?
I won't finish that joke. That when you're dead, you don't know you're dead. And only your family knows. Same with being stupid.
Yeah, when you're stupid, it works the same way. Right. And so death is nothing to be feared. Okay. what is to be feared is doctors who are filling you full of tubes and wanting to do surgery in the last 2 weeks of your life and that sort of thing. And I've made some mistakes along those lines. I urged a doctor to do surgery on my mother 2 weeks before her death. Now, what that surgery did was it gave her 2 more weeks. And for me, that 2 weeks was the sweetest time I had with my mother in my whole life. Okay, she was in the hospital. Our hospitals are wonderful because, or our local hospital is wonderful because every room is a private room and every room has a love seat that turns into a bed. And so family members can literally stay with the person that's dying or in there for whatever reason. And so, you have to make a judgment about whether something is worth it or not. And I did urge a doctor to do the surgery, and he did the surgery. And it bought my mother 2 weeks, but it was 2 weeks, the best 2 weeks of my life with my mother, and it was really worth it. But in the end, she died, and in the end, she was cremated, and her ashes were spread on her family farm, and where she had lived for 40 years. And so, but there's no chance that I would say that my mother is dead, finally dead, absolutely dead. She's assuredly not, and she won't be in my progeny for the next 1,000 years. She is so meaningful to all of us. My father too, but especially my mother, who was a force of nature. Okay, you want to comment further, Jordan?
Well, I think, I appreciate that the story there too, the touching piece of that 2 weeks where that made it all worthwhile. And at the same time, in my view on death, life is fatal. No one is getting out alive. So it's
Right.
not the worry about death. That's to me a discomfort or not being comfortable with the not knowing. We don't need to know what happens after. It's curious. It's a curiosity. I often wonder, afterlife, what's that? But I think the true death and the true tragedy is not living your life your way. And
Right.
I think what happens is that becomes unapologetic in that you are doing what's necessary for you, your way. And I think that's the whole point of the hero's journey, is to mature past the instruction manual, as it were, of parents and what you're told to do. And you literally break your own mold to, mold yourself through your experiences rather than your appearances.
Right. If you want to know what the afterlife is, I'll ask you, what year is it? Okay, because if you're watching this after 2046, which would be my
We're still
100th
talking.
it would be my 100th birthday if I last that long.
Isn't that when the asteroids?
Very likely you're hearing this from the afterlife.
2046. Isn't that when the Valentine's asteroid's supposed to hit the Earth or something?
I don't know, but I'm hopeful that I survived that long. But considering what's been happening to me in my life, I'm doubtful that I can actually make it, because I did have a fall about 10 days ago. You still see a little redness here from it, and a little blueness maybe in my eye from the black eye that came out of it. Our Mitch McConnell had a similar fall, and he had a concussion. Fortunately, I'm a hard-headed Dutchman, so the doctor could only say, "Well, we did a CT scan. You've got a normal head. Go on, get out of here. We're going to get you out of here." And
you bring up a good. retelling that story with your mom, one thing, I keep speaking back to Richard's comment about how you live, your life. One thing I found interesting is to look at people's famous last words, because and which of those people still had that same wonderful personality you knew all the way through life, or if they didn't have the famous last words, they probably lost it somewhere. But for example, the two that always stand out to me are Oscar Wilde and Voltaire. And Oscar Wilde's a little funnier in a less dry way, but he's unconscious for 2 days on his deathbed, and he's completely into fashion and all that. So he wakes up and he looks around and he says, "Oh my, it's either me or this wallpaper. One of us has to go." and, and he dies right then. And then Voltaire requested the last rites on his deathbed, and he was, relatively an atheist. But the priest says, Voltaire, shouldn't you renounce Satan and, convey your undying devotion to the Lord our God? And he went through that whole thing. And Voltaire eyebrows go, he goes, "Now's not the best time to be making new enemies."
Right. Okay. So anyway,
but there's, I think, a living personality in those people. So
yeah, let's just see where we're going here. All right. I think there's time to sort of close up, or at least complete Elijah and Salome. We'll read right through it. And then I'm going to stop at the end of the first full paragraph the first paragraph on 180, because then he starts talking about the serpent, and we'll save the serpent for next week. But anyway, so let me see if I can blast through it, or we'll share it. The scene of the mystery play is a deep place, like the crater of a volcano. My deep interior is a volcano that pushes out the fiery molten mass of the unformed and the undifferentiated. Thus, my interior gives birth to the children of chaos and the primordial mother. He who enters the crater also becomes chaotic matter. He melts. The formed in him dissolves and binds itself anew with the children of chaos. The powers of darkness, the ruling and the seducing, the compelling and the alluring, the divine and the devilish. These powers stretch beyond my certainties and limits on all sides, and connect me with all forms and with all distant beings and things, through which inner tidings of their being and their character develop in me. Because I have fallen into the source of chaos, into the primordial beginning, I myself become smelted anew in the connection with the primordial beginning, which at the same time it is what has been and what is becoming. At first I come to the primordial beginning in myself, but because I am a part of the matter and formation of the world, I also come into the primordial beginning of the world in the first place. I have certainly participated in life as someone formed and determined, but only through my formed and determined consciousness, and through this in a formed and determined piece of the whole world, but not in the unformed and undetermined aspects of the world that likewise are given to me. Yet it is given only to my depths, not to my surface, which is a formed and determined consciousness. The powers of my depths are predetermination and pleasure. Predetermination or forethinking is Prometheus, who, without determined thoughts, brings the chaotic into form and definition, who digs the channels and holds the object before pleasure. Forethinking also becomes before thought. Forethinking also comes before thought. But pleasure is the force that desires and destroys forms without form and definition. It loves the form in itself that it takes hold of and destroys the forms that it does not take. The forethinker is a seer, but pleasure is blind. It does not foresee, but desires what it touches. Forethinking is not powerful in itself and therefore does not move. But pleasure is power and therefore it moves. Forethinking needs pleasure to be able to come to form. Pleasure needs forethinking to come to form, which it requires. If pleasure lacked forming, pleasure would dissolve in manifoldness and become splintered and powerless through unending division, lost to the unending. If a form does not contain and compress pleasure within itself, it cannot reach the higher, since it always flows like water from above to below. All pleasure, when left alone, flows into the deep sea and ends in the deathly stillness of dispersal into unending space. Pleasure is not older than forethinking, and forethinking is not older than pleasure. Both are equally old and in nature intimately one. Only in man does the separate existence of both principles become apparent. Now that's the end of the reading, but I before I let Jordan talk, I want to mention one thing, and that is that when I left Japan, where I went to high school, to come back to college, I was boarding a ship in Yokohama, and the very last thing my father said to me before we parted was, "Beware of thin-lipped women, for there lies a sleeping volcano." And that came to my mind as I was reading this, and what an awesome thing that Jung wrote right there.
Wow.
So anyway, go ahead, Jordan.
That just it's interesting when he started talking about the flow and all this and the unending division. I think that unending division expressed by, divide any number by 2 and try to get to 0. You'll never reach it.
Right.
But it kind of reminds me of people saying, "Oh, well, just go with the flow." And I always then kind of turn back and say, no. Be fluid, but don't go with the flow. Only dead fish go with the flow. And it's the kind of thing where he's playing this pleasure and planning, the forethinking and the experience that he went into with the eros and the logos before. And so you have the conscious and the unconscious. The pleasure is the letting go to experience, and the forethinking is planning to have the power of pleasure. And then pleasure brings nourishment to further planning. So I think that what's interesting here is he's in a big way describing the perennial nature of life from, again, instead of eros and logos, he's calling it forethinking. I'm calling it planning, and pleasure. But that's, again, logos, forethinking, intellect, consciousness, eros, unconsciousness, and pleasure. And I think what's interesting is right foot, left foot. And, anything you do, I can't really do myself. I have to do it my way. It's all round peg, square hole. So he's really making a call here early in our reading to make sure you take your life, your way, your story, your mystery. And then he comes back to this forethinking and this pleasure piece. So there's giving form to the formless, and then the formless nourishing back to provide stronger, healthy, reinforced forms. And I think,
if you don't understand this, you're going to live somebody else's life, very simply.
Yeah.
I know that early in my life, I was always living by someone else's form. And that meant, getting myself through high school and doing fairly well with that, getting into college and then splitting off from my fellow collegians because I joined the Marines during the Vietnam War, and none of the people that I'm the only graduate of my college who was commissioned on graduation day. I was commissioned on graduation day by my father. And, because I thought living to that form would be the right thing for me. And everybody else was living somebody else's guidance. And I continued to do the same thing when I got out of the Marines. I think my joining the Marines saved my life during the Vietnam War, because if I hadn't, I would have ended up as a private in the Army and probably not doing what I wanted to do. And so, and today, I don't think I've changed that much, but now all of my classmates are way more right-wing than I am. We went to this little lefty college, but with one exception, a friend of mine named Mike Berkowitz, he's the only member of our class who's farther left and more liberal than I am. And everybody else is more conservative, whereas we were all little lefties at some level during our college years.
Mhm.
And I was the outlier as a conservative. I joined the Marines. Got my commission on graduation day. I was the only one in uniform on graduation day. And so things change, and it's not that I changed so much, but boy, did they ever change, and boy, did times ever change. And so, it was only, I became a lawyer. I got myself an MBA. All those things are doing things about someone else's rules. But here's the truth about degrees. Every degree will get you one job. That's it. Okay. And so after that, you have to invent yourself, no matter how many degrees you go for. Every degree gets you one job. And so I didn't quite realize that when I was coming through, and I stayed in college and university until I was 32. I got myself 3 college level degrees, and you could argue that I also got a master's degree in Chinese language, so that would be 4.
Oh, your video froze.
So now, and I'm saying this for posterity, whether I'm still alive or not, this is my afterlife saying that I am living the life that I want to live and not somebody else's life. So go ahead, Jordan.
Well, I was going to say, to share a similar and recent, relatively recent. When I was on the East Coast, and I started going through some serious trouble. Well, I was miserable, is why. And the thing is, then that's a complex taking over. That's, what are you going to do about it? But I had to, to find the treasure in the trouble, there was a lot of suffering, and for a long period. And what's interesting about that, though, is I know when I moved to Taos, when you said, I'm not surprised, because what happened is I righted my ship, but I had to have that deep down going where, in a sense, it was completely self-destructive. Except then what happened? It took that for me to shed the heavy mantle of what I was supposed to do to find what I'm in service to. Yeah. And I think that to me goes along the lines with, you were the only person in uniform. We follow these places where, in a sense, we're walking in the shadow of mom and dad, and they're usually pretty big shadows. And yeah, I remember my best friend, who I've known since 4th grade. At one point, he said, "Oh, not a late bloomer, but I'm so glad you finally realized turn left or right. It's easier to get out from under that long shadow of, and it's important. But you will be cold, you will be dark, you might suffer. It's not always going to be easy, but at the same time, I think that finding your way, I called that whole process my long road home. And a pilgrimage to learning myself instead of learning from others. And I think that, it was Robert Frost, I took the road less traveled, and that's important, because I think what happens is, regardless, was it Mark Twain said, if I find myself in the middle of the majority, I need to stop and pause and figure, where did I go wrong?
Right. Really true. Really true. Yeah. Well, I had the experience in this past week of teaching pre-K children for a day, all day, 8 hours. By the end of it, I was ready for a rubber room.
That's a marathon pre-K.
Right. But
give you a run for your money.
But at the beginning of the day, they were calling me grandpa as a pejorative. And, they were like, I'm not going to pay attention to this old white guy. Why should I pay any attention to him? But by the end of the day, they were treating it as a term of endearment. And so it seems that in that particular school, where I'm expecting to spend a fair amount of time over the next few weeks, I probably will be called grandpa, and it will be a appellation that I will wear proudly, since I am one. I have 10 grandchildren, and I am proud of that. Yes, go ahead, Jordan.
I was going to say, what a great, correspondence and synchronicity, because to be out of the mouth of the wisdom of babe, or out of the mouth of babes, the wisdom. Out on the plaza last week, this guy was walking with, her hands up like this. She's about 3 or 4, and they're walking, and he starts to, the wind kicks up really hard, and that's just, that's springing. That's how it's spring's coming in Taos. Well, it's interesting because he got a little agitated, and you heard him say, honey, I really don't like this wind. Let's go inside. It's staticky and it's upsetting me. And she just went, Dad, respect nature. And my head turned, because here, you just kind of feel this setup from a kid. It was like, you want to hear what's coming after. And he looked down at her and he said, what do you mean, respect nature? She said, we don't need to go inside. This wind, that's just nature having to breathe extra hard to birth spring. And, I'm going to steal that one. She couldn't have been at most 4. And so I get it. You have that appellation after a day, they learned the dark way, It's
right. Yeah. And some of these kids are pretty messy, right? So I point out to them that young people not much older than them are blaming my generation for leaving a dirty planet. And I just tell them, I'm not taking it anymore. Okay, you're leaving a dirty classroom here. Look around you at this mess. I didn't create this mess. You created it. I'm going to be gone pretty soon. And if you aren't going to clean up after yourselves, then it's going to be your fault, not my fault.
I've noticed too, with that kind of trash mentality, as it were, with a disposable society, people are so used to they drop their trash out of their car, on the street. And what's interesting is the whole psychological idea of molting, from initiation through passage, which is deep and often difficult. Well, it's no quick fix, but with all the trash, people are accustomed to not now, not this. And what's interesting is I think there's a superficial piece where, I hate to say this, but the modern evolution is starting to be just drop in your trash. And rather than shedding skins to transform. Now, at the same time, I've also noticed a lot of people in the mid-teens to early 20s, and they've got it going on. So it's as if the strong generation of World War II, strong generations lead to ease, and ease leads to weaker generations, and weaker generations lead to rebellion back to stronger generations. And so I think we're in that place where, with the average lifespan being longer, we see all four of those generational cycles at one time.
Right. Yeah.
And you can't blame the rest of the world for the trash that you dropped. I mean, the mess that you've made.
Right. We now have so many emoticons. I was trying to give an emoticon on the YouTube chat, and there are now so many emoticons that I can't even find the ones I want anymore.
Yeah, that's our new hieroglyphs, our visual language.
So I'm going to have to leave it at that. So thank you, Jordan. It's been a delight talking with you. And next week, on page 180 of the Reader's Edition of the Red Book by C.G. Jung, we'll be reading about the serpent as the third principle. And so that will be eye-opening as well. And so I look forward to seeing you then. Thanks, Jordan. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye. Thanks for being there yesterday. I did see you, but unfortunately, we didn't get to a question for you.
Well, that's why I unraised my hand. I figured other people should get their spot. And my question really was more general than it was specific to it, so I didn't want to. Right.
And we squeezed a lot out of that 2 hours, I must say, with Murray. We had over 100 people present throughout the time. We had about 86 or 87 max up on Zoom, but we had another 20 to 25 people consistently on YouTube, which added up to 120, I think, by the end of the hour, or the end of the 2 hours. So
when I looked at a minute 45 or something, I think there were 87, and right towards the end there were still 78. So I mean, it was a great turnout.
Right. So if you for the YouTube audience, if you have not seen the talk we had with Murray Stein yesterday, I've put the replay there. It's Men Under Construction, and I expressly did it yesterday because tonight is the Academy Awards, and you need to put what has happened to men over the last 20 years in context to understand why the Banshees of Inisherin is at least nominated for 9 awards. I'm going to put the link to Alexander Beiner's review of several things, including the Banshees of Inisherin, where he talks about the fact that men are in trouble and we have to find our way out of it. So I urge you to read Alexander's review. I never thought I would say this, because when I saw Banshees of Inisherin, I can't say as I liked it. I had to say, why are we making a movie like this, and why is it getting so many Academy Award nominations? I just couldn't feature that, and it was only because of Alexander Beiner's review that I really grokked it and appreciated what it's about. So it's an important essay that he wrote. I urge you to take a look at it, and I really urge you to watch the conversation we had with Murray Stein. well, yesterday. It was just awesome. And
Mhm.
so, all right. So peace,
Good
everyone.
stuff.
We'll see you next week. Bye.